Hey guys, tonight we are taking a trip back in time. Not to a grand palace or a heroic battlefield, but to the grimy, bustling, and frankly, quite smelly streets of 19th century London. We're going to experience life as one of the millions who flocked to the city during the Industrial Revolution, seeking a new life. It's a world where the air itself is an ingredient in your food, and the water is more of a soup than a beverage. A gentle warning, you might not have the stomach for what's on the menu. But hey, no pressure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always wonderful to see where you're all tuning in from. So please feel free to drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It connects us all in this quiet, late night space. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you isn't a sight, but a feeling. A dampness that seeps into your bones. A chill that has nothing to do with the weather. You've just arrived, stepping off a cart, or perhaps walking the last few miles into the great city. The England you knew of green fields and open skies has vanished, swallowed whole by something monstrous and alive. The air is thick, and you can taste it. It's a cocktail of coal smoke, the sharp, metallic tang that coats the back of your throat, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the river and something else, something organic and ever-present. It's the smell of too many people and too many horses crammed into one place. You stand there for a moment, a small, insignificant figure in a tide of humanity. The noise is a physical force, a constant, churning roar. It's not the sound of nature or even the familiar clamor of a market town. It's the sound of industry, the distant, rhythmic chugging of steam engines, the screech of metal on metal, the clatter of thousands of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones, and a ceaseless murmur of voices that never resolves into a single, clear conversation. It's the sound of a city that never sleeps, not because it's having fun, but because it can't afford to. Your eyes struggle to adjust. The sun, if it's even up there, is a pale, hazy dusk, a mere suggestion of light filtered through a permanent blanket of smog. They call it the pea souper here, a thick, yellow-gray fog that can descend at any time, turning midday into a murky twilight. It's a man-made weather system, born from the million coal fires burning in homes and factories. This isn't the clean, romantic fog of a mystery novel. It's a greasy, chemical stew that leaves a layer of fine, black soot on every surface, including your face and the inside of your lungs. You clutch the small bundle that holds all your worldly possessions and start to walk, letting the crowd pull you along. The buildings are a testament to this new age, endless rows of narrow brick houses, blackened by smoke, leaning against each other for support. There's a relentless uniformity to them, as if the city itself was built by a machine. There are no grand avenues here, only a labyrinth of narrow streets and even narrower alleys, slick with a perpetual layer of grime. You have to watch your step, not just to avoid the horse droppings, but the thick, black mud that seems to ooze from the very ground, a vile concoction of dirt, waste, and everything else the city discards. You look at the faces in the crowd. They are pale, hurried, and dashed with a weariness that seems to go beyond a simple day's work. You see children, but they don't look like the children you knew. They are small for their age, with old eyes, already part of the city as relentless machinery. You feel a knot forming in your stomach, a mix of impure, undiluted fear. Is there hope here or just a bigger, more crowded version of the poverty you left behind? Historians still debate this very feeling. Were the millions who flooded into cities like London during this era pulled by a genuine, albeit naive, belief in the myth of streets paved with gold, or were they pushed by the grim reality of rural collapse, arriving with no illusions, knowing only that the city was a gamble they had to take to survive? The academic consensus leans towards the latter. But the truth for you, standing in this overwhelming new reality, is likely a confused jumble of both, a desperate hope warring with a primal fear. As dusk begins to truly fall, the gas lamps flicker to life, casting long, dancing shadows. They don't illuminate the city so much as make the darkness more profound, creating pockets of eerie, yellow light in an ocean of black. You know you need to find a place to stay, a corner to rent in a shared room, and more pressingly, you need to find something to eat. Your stomach rumbles, a small, personal noise lost in the city's great roar. For the first time, you think about your next meal, not in terms of what you'd like to eat, but what you can possibly find and afford in this sprawling, smoke-choked wilderness of brick and steam. The journey for survival has just begun. Your throat is a desert, coated with the fine, black dust of the city's breath. The initial shock of arrival is fading, replaced by the simple, urgent demands of your own body. Before shelter, before work, there is thirst. You watch the flow of people, looking for a clue, and soon you see it, a queue of women and children clustered around a cast iron pillar on a street corner. A water pump. You join the line, your small bundle held tight against your chest. The mood here is one of grim patience. No one speaks much. The only sounds are the rhythmic, metallic squeak of the pump handle and the splash of water into wooden buckets and clay jugs. When it's your turn, you cup your hands and work the heavy handle. The water that spills out is cool, a momentary relief, but it isn't clear. It's a pale, cloudy gray, carrying tiny specks of something. You don't have the luxury of questioning it. You drink, and you drink deeply. The water is heavy, with a faint, mineral taste you can't quite place. It quenches the fire in your throat, but it sits uneasily in your stomach. The woman behind you, seeing the look on your face, gives a wary, humorless smile. Don't think too hard on it, she advises, her voice raspy. It all comes from the same big ditch anyway. She means the river, the Thames. From a distance, you might have imagined it as a majestic waterway, the heart of a great empire. Up close, you realize it's the city's stomach and its colon, a single, horrificously efficient system. As you find your way closer to its banks, the smell hits you long before you see it. It's a thick, gag-inducing miasma, the smell of decay on an industrial scale. The water itself is an opaque, brown-black slurry. You see things floating in it that your mind struggles to process: bloated carcasses of dogs and cats, rotting vegetables bobbing alongside, oily slicks of industrial effluent, and a constant, sinister film of what you realize is raw sewage. This is the main source of drinking water for much of London. Private water companies, competing for customers, would run their intake pipes out into the river. The problem, they often place them right next to the city's brand new sewer outlets. It was a perfect, closed loop of contamination. One of the great, dark ironies of the age was that the push for modern sewers, intended to clean up the streets by flushing waste away, made the river and thus the drinking water exponentially more toxic. Here's the thing that's hard to grasp: most people knew the water was foul. They just disagreed on why it was dangerous. The prevailing scientific theory of the day wasn't germ theory. The idea of tiny, invisible microbes causing disease was still seen as fringe and slightly ridiculous. The dominant belief was in miasma theory, the idea that disease was spread by bad smells, by foul air. So for you, standing by the Thames, the overwhelming fear isn't what's in the water, but the stench rising from it. You instinctively hold your breath, believing the smell itself is what will make you sick. The tragic result was that if water didn't smell too bad, or if it was drawn from a pump far enough away from the riverbank to lose its immediate odor, people assumed it was relatively safe. This is a point historians still puzzle over. How much did the average person really understand about the link between the water and the constant stomach ailments? The cholera outbreaks that swept through these neighborhoods like wildfire. Some argue that people were simply resigned to it, that chronic sickness was such a part of life it was considered normal. Others suggest a kind of folk knowledge existed, an unspoken understanding that certain pumps were better than others, without knowing the scientific reason why. For you, the knowledge is simpler. You feel the strange weight of that water in your gut and you make a mental note, only drink when you absolutely have to. As you walk away from the river, you notice something else. Different houses have small signs or markings on them. This was part of the bizarre, almost comical competition between the water companies. They would fight, sometimes literally, for control of neighborhoods, and their supply was often unreliable. A weird but true side effect was that fire brigades would sometimes arrive at a burning building only to find the local water company had cut off the supply due to an unpaid bill, or that they were contracted with a rival company and had no access to the nearest water plug. The city's lifeline was in the hands of for-profit businesses that saw water not as a right, but as a product to be sold, no matter its quality. The cool liquid in your stomach now feels less like life, giving water and more like a ticking clock. Every sip is a gamble. You've put the city inside of you. It's dirt, it's waste, it's indifference. The thirst is gone, but a deeper, more unsettling anxiety has taken its place. It's the slow, dawning realization that in this new world, the most basic elements of survival, the very water you need to live, might be the things that harm you the most. Now, with that unsettling thought settling in, the gnawing hunger returns. More potent than before. You need something solid. You need bread. The search for bread leads you into a maze of backstreets, each one narrower and darker than the last. The scent of baking, which should be one of the most comforting smells in the world, is faint here, constantly overpowered by the pervasive aromas of coal, smoke, and damp rot. Finally, you spotted a small bakery, its window grimy and steamed up from the inside. A simple, hand-painted sign reads, "Bread, fresh daily." It's a beacon of hope. You push open the heavy wooden door, and a small bell jingles. A wave of warm, yeasty air washes over you, a welcome change from the chill outside. The baker, a large man with flour-dusted eyebrows and arms as thick as logs, barely glances at you. He's busy pulling loaves from a massive brick oven. They aren't a golden brown, artisanal loaves you might imagine. They are a stark, almost unnaturally uniform white. They look heavy, dense, and perfect, too perfect. You lay a couple of your precious pennies on the wooden counter. It's a significant portion of what you have left. The baker grunts, slides a loaf across the worn surface, and sweeps the coins into a drawer. The loaf is heavier than you expect, surprisingly hefty for its size. You clutch it to your chest. It's still warm, and that simple warmth is a profound comfort. It feels substantial, real, a promise of sustenance. Finding a quiet stoop in a slightly less graphic tally, you break off a piece. The crust is hard, but it yields with a dull crack rather than a satisfying crunch. The inside is dense, damp, and shockingly white. You take a bite. The texture is the first thing that's wrong. It's slightly gritty, with a pasty, cloying quality that sticks to the roof of your mouth. The taste is bland, lacking the complex, nutty flavor of real wheat. It tastes of chalk, because it is. Welcome to the cornerstone of the London poor's diet, and the masterpiece of 19th century food adulteration, the London loaf. Bread was life, for you and millions like you. It would make up the bulk of your daily calories. And because it was so essential, it was the perfect target for improvement. The baker wasn't necessarily a malicious man trying to poison his customers. In his mind, he was just a savvy businessman. The public, especially the poor, had come to associate the color white with purity and quality. Brown bread was seen as coarse, rustic, and inferior. So a baker who could produce the whitest loaves for the lowest price would corner the market. How did he achieve this with a chemistry set of ingredients that had no business being in food? The main adulterant was alum, or potassium aluminum sulfate. A little pinch of this crystalline powder worked magic. It strengthened the gluten in low quality or old flour, allowing it to hold more water. More water meant a heavier loaf from the same amount of flour, which meant pure profit. Crucially, Accum also bleached the flour, turning a dingy, grayish dough into that prized, pristine white. Your loaf is heavy because it's waterlogged, and it's white because it's been chemically bleached. But Accum was just the start. To add even more cheap bulk and whiteness, bakers would routinely mix in chalk dust, which you're tasting as a fine grit. Some historians even cite contemporary accounts of plaster of Paris being used for the same purpose. It was white, it was heavy, and it was cheap. This wasn't a secret confined to the darkest corners of the city. It was common knowledge, an open secret of the trade. An 1820 treatise on food adulteration by a chemist named Friedrich Accum flatly stated, "The baker's trade is a mere craft of imposition and fraud." One of the weirdest and most debated justifications you might hear from a baker of the time was that they were actually helping you. Some would argue, with a straight face, that adding these extenders allowed them to sell a larger looking, heavier loaf for a lower price, making bread more accessible to the poor. The fact that this bread had a fraction of the nutritional value and was actively causing digestive distress was just an inconvenient externality. The historical debate here is one of intent versus impact. Was this a cynical, profit-driven fraud, or a lurked, self-justifying system where everyone, from the miller to the baker to the consumer, was trapped in a race to the bottom? The evidence overwhelmingly points to fraud. But the perpetrator's rationalizations are a fascinating window into the era's mindset. You take another bite, chewing slowly, trying to force it down. Your body craves the energy, but your senses are screaming that something is wrong. The alum, a powerful astringent, is already beginning to work on your digestive system, causing a subtle, tightening feeling in your gut. It was known to cause severe constipation and, over the long term, chronic inflammation of the stomach lining. For a child, or someone already weakened by hunger, a diet heavy in alum-laced bread could be a slow, creeping death sentence. You wrap the remaining bread carefully in its cloth. This is your food for the day, maybe even for tomorrow. It's a lump of false promises. It looks like bread, it feels like bread, but it nourishes like a stone. It fills your stomach, but it leaves you empty. As you sit on that cold stone step, the reality of your new life becomes brutally clear. Survival here isn't just about earning enough money to buy food. It's about surviving the food itself, and this is just the beginning. The bread, as it turns out, is one of the more benign deceptions you'll encounter. You force yourself to finish another piece of the chalky, heavy bread. The initial discomfort in your gut is settling into a dull, persistent ache. You tell yourself it's just hunger pangs, the feeling of an empty stomach finally getting something in it. But a part of you knows better. As you tear off another chunk of the loaf, your fingers find something hard. You pick it out. It's a small, whitish fleck, not chalky, but sharp, almost crystalline. You rub it between your thumb and forefinger. It disintegrates into a fine, sharp powder, plaster of Paris perhaps, or perhaps something else. This is where the story of the London loaf descends from simple fraud into the truly grotesque. While alum and chalk were the standard adulterants for creating the desirable white heft, they were by no means the only ingredients in the baker's non-culinary pantry. For bakers serving the absolute poorest neighborhoods, where a penny saved was the only thing that mattered, the list of fillers became even more macabre. The most notorious of these was ground-up bone, animal bones, often collected by the city's destitute, bongy rubbers, who scavenged them from rubbish heaps in the banks of the Thames, could be baked, bleached, and pulverized into a fine, white powder. This bone ash was even cheaper than chalk and served the same purpose. It added weight and whiteness to the loaf. So, the bread you're holding might contain the literal ghosts of London's waste, the skeletal remains of a butcher's scraps or a thrown-out meal, repackaged and sold back to you as food. Contemporary accounts and later analyses confirmed this practice. painting a grim picture of a circular economy where nothing, not even the marrow of a bone, was truly wasted. And it didn't stop there. In his shocking 1820 book, A Treatise on Adulteration as of Food and Culinary Poisons, the chemist Friedrich Accum described bakers using potato flour to bulk out the dough. This might sound harmless, even nutritious, compared to bone dust, but the issue was, again, deception and economics. Potato flour was far cheaper than wheat flour and could absorb an astonishing amount of water. A baker could use a small amount of low-grade wheat flour, a large amount of potato flour, and a huge amount of water, held together with alum, to produce a loaf that looked and felt substantial but had a fraction of the protein and nutrients of a real wheat loaf. You'd eat it, feel full for an hour, and then be hit with a wave of weakness as your body realized it had been tricked. The academic world still discusses the sheer scale and audacity of this. Was this a practice confined to a few truly villainous bakers in the darkest slums, or was it a widespread, industry standard technique? While the most extreme examples like bone dust were likely less common, the use of potato flour and other cheap grains like barley or rye, all whitened with alum, was almost certainly the norm in working-class districts. It was a system of institutionalized malnutrition, built loaf by loaf. Here's a small, strange detail that highlights the pervasiveness of this deception: the salt. You'd assume the salt in your bread was just salt, but often it wasn't. To save a few more fractions of a penny, some bakers would mix rocks salt with soapstone, a soft, easily powdered mineral. It was yet another way to add weight for almost no cost. It's a level of penny pinching-ness that is almost artistic in its depravity. You look down at the loaf in your hands, and it suddenly seems menacing. It's a Frankenstein-esque monster of a food, stitched together from cheap flour, chemicals, water, and waste. Every bite is a lottery. Is this mouthful just chalk and alum, or did this one get a bit of bone dust, maybe some plaster? The dull ache in your stomach now feels more pointed, more specific. It's the feeling of your body trying to process materials it was never designed to ingest. The psychological toll is as significant as the physical one. You can't trust the most basic food, the very thing that is supposed to represent life. The staff of life is a source of anxiety and suspicion. It fosters a sense of powerlessness, a feeling that you are being cheated at every turn, even in the simple act of trying to feed yourself. This wasn't a bug in the system for many. It was the system. The industrial city required a massive, cheap labor force, and this cheap labor force had to be fed as cheaply as possible. The nutritional quality of that food was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. You wrapped the bread up again, your appetite gone, replaced by a cuisine ease. You saved it from the grimy street, but you can't save it from itself. You now understand that in London, hunger isn't just about an empty stomach. It's about a stomach filled with lies. And as you'll soon discover, this elaborate deception extends far beyond the baker's oven. Every shop, every street vendor, is a potential player in the same game. Next, you think about getting something to spread on this sorry excuse for bread, a bit of fat to provide some much needed energy. The bread sits like a stone in your gut, a dry, jaggy lump crying out for some kind of moisture or fat to make it palatable. The dream is a smear of rich, yellow butter. The reality is whatever you can afford. You wander past a dairy shop, its window displaying a pale, waxy-looking black-labeled butter. The price makes you flinch. It's a luxury reserved for the middling classes, far beyond your reach. But next to it, for a fraction of the price, are tubs of other fats, lard, dripping, and various unnamed greasy substances simply sold as cooking fat. You decide to splurge a little, not on the butter, but on the next best thing. You find a small, dingy grocer's shop, the kind of place that sells a little bit of everything and smells vaguely of mice and damp sawdust. In a wooden tub near the counter is a yellowish, soft substance. It's not quite butter, but it's sold as such. or at least with a knowing wink. You spend a penny for a small scoop, which the grocer scrapes onto a piece of greaseproof paper. Back in your alleyway, you unwrap your prize. It doesn't have the clean, creamy smell of fresh butter. It smells of very little. Actually, with a slightly waxy, chemical undertone. You smear a little on your plaster and bone bread. The texture is wrong. It's too smooth, almost slippery, and it doesn't melt with the warmth of the bread. It just sits there. You take a bite. It's greasy. Yes, but in a thin, watery way. It coats your mouth with a slick film, but provides none of the rich satisfaction you were hoping for. You've just purchased your first taste of systematically adulterated fat. The butter sold in poor neighborhoods was often a masterpiece of chemical engineering. True butter was routinely bulked up with cheaper fats like lard rendered pig fat or tallow rendered beef or mutton fat. That was the relatively honest deception. The real artistry came in adding water. By constantly churning and working the fat, a skilled grocer could incorporate a surprising amount of water, held in suspension. This, of course, added weight and volume for zero cost. To mask the resulting pallid color and watery texture, they would add coloring agents, sometimes harmless annatto, but often more dubious chemicals, and use starches, or even gelatin to help bind the whole concoction together. But what you've likely bought is even a step below that. It could be what was known as recovered butter. This involved taking old, rancid butter that was unfit for sale, melting it down, boiling it with charcoal to help remove the foul taste and smell, and then churning it with water and fresh milk to give it a semblance of its former self. It was a form of culinary necromancy, bringing spoiled food back from the dead to be sold again. Here's a small, weird fact about this process. One of the biggest challenges for these adulterators was getting the texture right. Real butter has a specific melting point and firmness. To replicate this, some of the more inventive grocers would create a buzz or emulsion of cheaper fats and then, according to some contemporary investigators, clarify it using the rendered brains of sheep or calves. The brain matter acted as an emulsifier, helping to bind the fat and water together into a more convincing, butter-like substance. The historical evidence for this is debated. Was it a widespread practice or a shocking but rare example used to sensationalize the problem? Academics still argue about the prevalence of such extreme methods, but the fact that it was credibly reported at all speaks volumes about the anything goes attitude of the time. And what if you couldn't even afford the fake butter? You'd buy dripping. Dripping is the fat and juices that collect at the bottom of a roasting pan. In a wealthy household, this would be a delicious, savory byproduct of a Sunday roast. But the dripping you could buy from a cook shop or butcher was a different beast entirely. It was often a collection of all the cheapest, oldest fats, rendered down together, a greasy sludge of unknown origin, sold for pennies a pound. It was pure, cheap energy, and for many, a smear of dripping on a slice of that terrible bread was a daily meal. It was the taste of survival, greasy, often slightly rancid, but calorie-dense. You look at the greasy smear on your bread, the film it leaves on your fingers. The lack of flavor is almost more disturbing than a bad flavor would be. It's an edible substance that provides calories but no pleasure, no comfort. It highlights a fundamental truth of your new life. Food has been stripped of all its secondary purposes: community, culture, enjoyment, and reduced to its most brutal, biological function: fuel. And you, the worker, are the engine that needs fueling, as cheaply and efficiently as possible. The combination of the chemical bread and the mystery fats, it's uneasily in your stomach. It's a heavy, indigestible pairing. You feel sluggish, bloated. This isn't the feeling of being nourished, it's the feeling of being filled, like a sack being stuffed with sand. The city is feeding you, yes, but it's feeding you its scraps, its deceptions, its industrial waste. You are consuming the very essence of your environment. Having dealt with the solids, your mind turns to another supposed staple, something you might get for a child, or to wash down this greasy meal: milk. Your meal of chemical bread and mystery fat is a heavy, greasy lump in your stomach. You feel a desperate need for something to wash it down, something to cut through the unpleasant film coating your mouth. Your thoughts turn to milk. It's a symbol of purity, of nourishment, of childhood. Perhaps, you think, you can find a bit of simple, honest sustenance there. You see a woman ladling a white liquid from a large metal churn on the street corner. A milk cellar. Children, jugs in hand, are clustered around her. You approach and hand over another of your precious coins for a small measure. She dips a ladle into the churn and pours a thin, bluish white liquid into the cup you hold out. It looks weak, anemic. You take a sip. It's watery, with only a faint, ghostly memory of the taste of milk. It's also slightly sweet, but in a strange, tacky way that doesn't feel natural. You've just been introduced to the London milk trade, a business that was, in many ways, even more systematically corrupt than the bakers. The journey of your milk likely began in a squalid city dairy. Forget idyllic images of cows and green pastures. Most of London's milk came from cows kept in horrific conditions in cramped, filthy sheds in the city's back alleys. These animals were often sick, fed on distillery waste and brewers' grains, and lived their short, miserable lives, standing in their own filth. The milk they produced was already of poor quality, thin and bluish, but that was only the beginning of its transformation. The process was known as the black cow, a slang term for the water pump. For every gallon of milk, a milkman would often add a gallon or more of water. This was the most basic and universal adulteration. Of course, this diluted the milk to a watery, unconvincing consistency. So, the next step was to restore its appearance. A thickener was needed. The most common addition was starch or flour, which would be boiled with the milk to give it more body. But the real trick was in the color and taste. To counteract the bluish tint from the water, adulterators would add something to make it look white and creamy. The most common ingredient was chalk, finely powdered and mixed in. This is the source of that strange, sweetish, gritty taste. It gave the illusion of richness. Here is where the story gets truly disturbing. One of the most prized additives, according to contemporary investigators like Arthur Hill Hassel, was animal brain. Sheep's or cat's brains would be mashed into a pulp and emulsified with the watery milk. A small amount of this gruesome additive would give the liquid a convincing, creamy opacity that chalk alone couldn't achieve. It's a detail so grotesque it's hard to believe, but it appears in multiple reports from the era. Historians still debate how common the use of brain matter was. Was it a shocking outlier used by a few ghoulish dairymen, or a more widespread trick of the trade that was simply whispered about, while chalk was almost certainly ubiquitous? The use of brains likely represented the more extreme end of the spectrum. The consensus is that it definitely happened, but its prevalence is hard to pin down. Regardless, it speaks to a mindset where food was seen as a substance to be manipulated, with its appearance being far more important than its actual content. This milk was then often treated with a preservative to stop it from souring too quickly, especially in the summer heat. The most common was borax, but formaldehyde, a chemical now used for embalming, was also sometimes used in small quantities. It was fantastically effective at killing bacteria, but it was also a poison. So the cup of milk in your hand is a chemical cocktail. It's mostly water, thickened with starch, whitened with chalk or worse, sweetened with sugar or molasses to hide the watery taste, and potentially preserved with a toxic chemical. It has very little of the nutritional value of real milk. For the thousands of infants in London whose diet consisted almost entirely of this substance, it was a death sentence. They were being simultaneously starved of nutrients and slowly poisoned. The shockingly high infant mortality rate in the slums was no mystery. It was a direct consequence of this kind of institutionalized fraud. You look at the thin, white liquid in your cup. It's a perfect metaphor for the city itself. It presents an image of wholesomeness, but it's a diluted, deceptive, and dangerous imitation. You pour the rest onto the grimy cobblestones. The feeling of being cheated is now a constant companion. It gnaws at you, almost as much as the physical hunger. Every transaction feels like a battle of wits. You are destined to lose. You have been tricked by the baker, the grocer, and now the milk seller. You begin to wonder if there is a single, honest piece of food to be had in this entire city. As this thought crosses your mind, you see a shop displaying a large, brightly colored wheel of cheese, and for a moment, your hope flickers anew. Your hope, ever resilient, flickers at the sight of the cheese. It sits on the grocer's counter, a magnificent, robust-looking wheel. Its color is a deep, enticing orange red, the kind you associate with a fine, well-aged Gloucester or Cheshire cheese. It promises sharp, salty, concentrated flavor, a powerful antidote to the blandness of your bread and the greasy emptiness of your fake butter. Cheese as a preserved food, a way of making milk last. Surely, you think, this must be safer, more honest. You spend another precious penny on a small wedge. The grocer cuts it for you with a wire, and the slice comes away clean. He wraps it in paper, and you hurry off with your purchase, feeling a small thrill of anticipation. You find your spot and unwrap it. The color is just as vibrant up close. It even smells a bit like cheese. A faint, tangy aroma. You break off a corner and place it in your mouth. The first sensation is disappointment. The texture is soapy and waxy, not firm and crumbly. It coats your tongue in a strange, slightly fatty film. The flavor is weak, almost non-existent, with a bizarre, metallic aftertaste that begins to build at the back of your throat. You swallow, and a subtle warmth spreads through your stomach, not the pleasant warmth of good food, but a low-grade, chemical heat. You have just eaten a piece of cheese colored with red lead. The adulteration of cheese was as common as that of bread and milk, but it followed a different logic. With cheese, the primary deception was, once again, color. A rich, uniform color was a sign of quality, suggesting a high-fat content from the milk of grass-fed cows. Cheaper cheese, made from skimmed milk, was naturally pale and unappetizing. To make this inferior product marketable, cheesemongers turned to a palette of toxic artists' materials. The most common coloring agent for that bright reddish or orange hue was annatto. Annatto is a natural, plant-based dye and is relatively harmless, but annatto cost money, cheaper, and far more dangerous, were mineral pigments. To achieve that desirable Gloucester red, some producers would use red lead, a poisonous lead oxide. For a bright, buttery yellow, they might use chromat of lead. Both are potent, cumulative poisons. They don't make you sick immediately. They build up in your body over time, leading to nerve damage, developmental problems in children, and a host of other agonizing, chronic conditions. But the fraud didn't stop at color. The cheese itself was often a sham. Low-quality cheese might be made from milk that was already starting to turn, or from skim milk that had all the valuable cream removed to make butter. To make up for the lack of fat, some cheesemakers would melt down and incorporate other, cheaper fats, often of dubious origin, like lard or low-grade tallow. Sometimes, they would mash old, unsellable cheese with potatoes and a little new milk, press it into a mold, and sell it as fresh. Your soapy textured wedge is likely a product of this kind of culinary recycling. A block of mashed potato and old cheese fat, beautifully painted with poison. Here's a bizarre and little-known fact about the cheese trade of the time: it was a magnet for mites. Cheese mites are microscopic arachnids that thrive on aging cheese, and a heavily infested whale could lose a significant amount of its weight to these tiny creatures. Some less than scrupulous merchants had a startling solution. According to reports from the period, they would take a mite-eaten, crumbling old cheese, mash the whole thing up mites and all, and mix it with a binder. The mites, being rich in protein, would simply be reincorporated into the product. It's a point that historians sometimes referenced with a grim chuckle the most nutritious part of the cheese might have been the bugs. The question of consumer awareness is, as always, a source of debate. Did people know they were eating lead? Almost certainly not in the specific chemical sense. But did they know the cheese was off? Probably. They might have complained of a hot or biting taste, which was the lead reacting with their saliva. They would have known it was low grade, but they had little choice. The choice was between good cheese and bad cheese. It was between bad cheese and no cheese at all. The vibrant color was a marketing trick that worked. In a world of gray, sludged, pale imitations, a flash of bright color was inherently attractive, a promise of richness, even if it was a lie. You stare at the remaining wedge of reddish cheese. It looks so cheerful, so full of promise, that now you know its secret. The color isn't a sign of quality, it's a mask for inferiority. The satisfying weight in your hand isn't from rich milk, it's from potatoes and cheap lard. And the faint, metallic tang on your tongue is the taste of poison. You've tried water, bread, butter, milk, and cheese. 5 for 5. Every single staple has been a deception. You feel a wave of weary cynicism wash over you. Is there anything left to try? The day is long and draining. Perhaps a cup of tea, a simple, warming cup of tea. That's a comfort the city can't possibly corrupt, or so you hope. The desire for a cup of tea becomes an obsession. It's more than just a beverage, it's a ritual, a symbol of civilization and comfort amidst the grime. Tea promises a moment of quiet warmth, a small, affordable luxury that can momentarily wash away the foul tastes and anxieties of the day. You find a small shop selling dry goods and spot the familiar-looking black leaves in a large wooden chest. You spend your coin on a tiny packet of what is labeled simply as black tea. With your precious purchase secured, you need to find hot water. This, in itself, is a challenge. You might pay a small fee to the keeper of your lodging house to use the communal fire, or perhaps find a street vendor selling hot water from a kettle. After navigating this small hurdle, you finally find a corner to perform the ritual. You drop the dark, brittle leaves into your cup and pour the steaming water over them. You watch as the leaves unfurl and the water begins to darken. But something is not quite right. The color is instantaneous and strangely uniform. A deep, inky black rather than a rich, reddish brown. And there are odd little particles floating on the surface. Things that don't look like tea leaves. You let it steep for a moment, then take a cautious sip. The flavor is harsh, bitter, and astringent, with an underlying taste of earth and something else. Something faintly chemical. There is none of the fragrant, complex aroma you associate with real tea. You have just brewed a cup of slang, the trade name for counterfeit tea. Tea was hugely popular, but also heavily taxed and expensive, making it a prime candidate for adulteration. What you have in your cup is likely a clever and disgusting blend, a masterpiece of fraud that begins where a proper cup of tea ends. The base ingredient for this counterfeit tea was often used tea leaves. Large hotels, restaurants, and wealthy households would sell their spent leaves to tea dealers. These individuals would take the soggy, boiled out leaves, dry them on hot copper plates, and then face them to restore their appearance. Facing was the process of adding color. To make them look like black tea, they would be dyed with logwood, a type of wood that produces a dark dye, and sometimes mixed with lead or copper filings to add weight and a bit of a sheen. To imitate green tea, they would use a toxic cocktail of Prussian blue, a chemical pigment, and turmeric, which would give the leaves a vibrant but completely artificial green hue. But what if used tea leaves weren't available? The counterfeiters got creative. They would use the leaves of other, cheaper plants. Sycamore, hawthorn, or sloe leaves were common. These would be dried, broken up, and then dyed to resemble the real thing. This is where the earthy taste comes from. It's the taste of the English hedgerow, not the Chinese tea garden. Here's the truly weird and disgusting part of the process. A detail that seems almost unbelievable. To mimic the small, corralled appearance of certain types of black tea, and to add some extra bulk, some of the most unscrupulous dealers would mix in dried sheep's dung. The dung, when crumbled and dried, could be processed to look remarkably like low-grade tea leaves, especially when mixed in with other counterfeit ingredients, undyed black. It's a fact that contemporary investigators reported with a mixture of horror and outrage. Historians still discuss these reports, and while some suggest they might have been exaggerated to create public outcry, the consistency of the claims across multiple sources suggests it was a very real, if hopefully not universal, practice. It gives a whole new meaning to a robust, earthy flavor. The academic debate here often centers on the supply chain. How far up the chain did this fraud go? Was it just the back alley grocer trying to cheat a poor customer? Or were the major tea importers and wholesalers complicit? Evidence suggests the deception happened at every level. Dock workers might sweep up spilled tea dust from the dirty floors, mix it with other dust and debris, and sell it as sweepings. Wholesalers would knowingly buy counterfeit tea to blend with their real stock to increase its volume. It was a pervasive, industry-wide problem. You stare into your murky, black cup. The liquid that promised so much comfort is just another lie. It's a brew of second-hand leaves, floor sweepings, chemical dyes, and possibly things far, far worse. The astringent, chemical taste scrapes at your throat. It's not just a bad cup of tea, it's a violation. It takes a symbol of warmth and domesticity and turns it into another source of poison and disgust. The simple act of making a cup of tea, which should have been a small moment of peace, has become another lesson in the CDS profound cynicism. Every single thing you have tried to consume has been a trick. The bread was a rock, the butter was a chemical slick, the milk was chalky water, the cheese was a painted poison, and now the tea is a cup of industrial waste. A profound weariness sets in, a fatigue that is deeper than physical exhaustion. It's a weariness of the spirit. The constant vigilance required to simply eat is draining. As you sit there, nursing your cup of fake tea, the smell of roasting meat wafts from a nearby cook shop. It's a smell so rich, so primal, so fundamentally real that it cuts through the smog and your cynicism. Meat, the ultimate luxury. Could meat be the one thing that has to be honest? The smell of roasting meat is intoxicating. It's a deep, savory aroma that speaks of wealth, celebration, and, most importantly, powerful nutrition. It pulls you from your reverie of fake tea and leads you down the street toward a cook shop. Its windows steamy and glowing. Inside, you can see joints of meat turning on a spit, glistening with fat. For most people in your position, buying a whole joint is an impossible dream. But you might, just might, be able to afford a small slice, or perhaps some cheap cuts from the butcher next door. You bypass the expensive cook shop and find a small, open-fronted butcher's stall. Slabs of beef and mud unhang from iron hooks, alongside strings of sausages and trays of offal. The butcher, a stout man in a blood-stained apron, is chopping meat with a heavy cleaver. The prices are high, but there are cheaper options: scraggly cuts, bony pieces, and miscellaneous trimmings. You point to a small, dark-looking piece of mutton. Pay your money, and he wraps it for you in a piece of paper that quickly becomes translucent with grease. You have no way to cook it properly, so you gnaw on it as is, or perhaps you find a vendor to grill it for a small fee. The texture is tough, stringy, and it takes a lot of chewing. The flavor is strong, gourmet, and slightly off, with a faint soreness you try to ignore. But it's meat, it's protein. You can feel the strength it seems to impart almost immediately. A welcome change from the empty calories you've been consuming. But the question you should be asking yourself is not what kind of meat is this, but where did this meat come from in the sprawling, unregulated metropolis? The answer is often horrifying. The meat available to the poor came from sources that would be condemned in a heartbeat today. A significant portion was from animals that were sick or had died of disease. A farmer whose cow contracted tuberculosis or anthrax wouldn't just dispose of the carcass HED sell it at a steep discount to a city butcher who knew how to handle such things. These butchers were skilled at disguising the signs of disease. They would carefully cut away the most obvious tumors or lesions. If the meat was discolored, they had tricks for that. A wash of sulfur dioxide could bleach dark or greenish meat to a more appetizing pinkish hue. If the meat was from an old, tough animal, they could make it appear more tender and youthful by inflating the carcass. This was done with a pipe and a pair of bellows, pumping air under the skin to make a scrawny animal look plump and well-fleshed. The faint soreness you taste could be the beginning of putrefaction. Butchers were masters at masking the smell of decay. They would use large amounts of salt, pepper, and strong spices like sage to overpower any off odors. They might wash the meat in a solution of pyroligneous acid, a type of crude, with vinegar to give it a smoky, fresh scent. You, the consumer, would bite into it and think you were tasting a strongly seasoned piece of mutton, when in fact you were tasting the chemical camouflage of decomposition. This brings us to a weird, and frankly, disgusting tidbit of the 19th century meat trade: slink meat. Slink was the term for the meat from stillborn calves or lambs, or those that had been aborted. It was, by its very nature, incredibly cheap a waste product, but it was also pale, watery, and had a very strange texture. Unscrupulous butchers would sell this as cheap veal or lamb to the unsuspecting poor, often using their chemical tricks to give it a better color and mask any unpleasant properties. Historians confirm this practice through court records and investigative reports of the time, painting a grim picture of a trade that exploited the most vulnerable parts of the food chain. The debate among historians often revolves around the consumer's role in this. Were people completely duped, or was there a tacit understanding? The latter seems more likely. When you bought meat for a price that was clearly too good to be true, you probably knew you weren't getting prime quality. It was a calculated risk. You needed the protein, you needed the calories, and you were willing to overlook the dubious origins to get it. The butcher wasn't just selling meat, he was selling plausible deniability. He made it look good enough and smell good enough for you to quiet the suspicious voice in your head. You finish the tough, gummy piece of meat. Your jaw aches from the effort of chewing. It sits in your stomach, a heavy counterpoint to the chemical bread. You do feel stronger, but also slightly queasy. You've taken another gamble, and you won't know for a day or two whether you've won or lost. The meat could nourish you, or it could give you a severe case of food poisoning, or worse, introduce you to a persistent pathogen. This is the grim reality of luxury. For you, meat isn't a pleasure, it's a high-stakes bet. It's a rare and precious fuel source that comes with a hidden list of potentially lethal side effects. As you wipe the grease from your hands, you hear the cry of a street vendor selling hot pies. The smell is, if possible, even more alluring than the roasting joint. It's the smell of meat and pastry and hot gravy, all combined into a convenient, hand-held meal. It seems like the perfect solution. But if the meat on the hook is this suspect, what on earth is inside that pie? The allure of the meat pie is undeniable. It's hot, it's cheap, and it's self-contained. You don't need a plate or a kitchen, it's the perfect street food for a life lived on the move. The vendor, a man with a booming voice and a large, heated Tim, cries out, "Hot pies, get your lovely meat pies." The smell of hot pastry, savory gravy, and something vaguely meaty is a powerful siren song to your empty stomach. You watch as a docker, black with coal dust, buys one, bites into it, and steam billows out. He chews with a look of profound, if fleeting, satisfaction. You decide to risk it. You part with another hard-earned penny, and the vendor hands you a small, greasy parcel. The crust is a pale, slightly soggy golden brown. It's warm in your hands, a small pocket of heat against the city-ass damp trail. You find a doorway to lean in and take your first, cautious bite. The pastry is mostly tasteless. a simple flour and lard affair. Inside is a thick, brown, gelatinous gravy, and suspended within it are small, grayish, unidentifiable morsels of what is supposed to be meat. The flavor is overwhelmingly of salt and pepper. The meat itself has very little taste, and its texture is disconcertingly soft, almost mushy. You chew, and you swallow. It's filling, it's hot, but as you take another bite, you can't help but wonder what exactly are you eating. Welcome to the murky, terrifying world of the 19th century meat pie, a culinary mystery box where the contents were a subject of grim speculation and dark humor. The pies were nicknamed growlers by the public, supposedly because they were filled with the meat of stray dogs. While that was likely a gruesome urban legend, the reality wasn't much better. The meat in these pies was, by definition, the cheapest the pie maker could possibly find. It was the absolute bottom of the barrel. This meant it was often meat that was not just diseased, but actively decaying. The pie maker's art was not in baking, but in alchemy, the transformation of putrid flesh into something edible. Strong spices, vast quantities of salt, and thick, floury gravy were the tools of the trade, essential for masking the taste and smell of decomposition. So what was in it? The base was often scraps and trimmings from the butcher, the gristle, the fat, the bits of organ meat that couldn't be sold on their own, but it frequently included much more. Eels from the polluted Thames were a common filler. Being cheap and plentiful, they would be chopped up and thrown into the mix, their flavor lost in the gravy. But the most notorious and widely suspected ingredients were domestic animals. The pies were often called cat pies or kitten pies, and the suspicion was very real. In the poorest parts of the city, people's beloved pets would sometimes mysteriously vanish, and the joke, tinged with genuine fear, was that they'd ended up in Mr. Tasteway's pies. Here's a small, weird fact that lends some credibility to these grim tales. There was an entire black market economy for the carcasses of cats and dogs. Their skins were valuable for making cheap furs and other goods, which left the meat as a nearly free byproduct. For a pie maker operating on the slimmest of margins, the temptation to use this free meat would have been immense. Historians are still in debate about the true scale of this practice. Was it a common, accepted part of the slum economy, or a shocking, sensationalized horror story? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. It certainly happened, but perhaps not every pie contained a neighborhood tabby. The uncertainty, however, was part of the terror and the culture surrounding the food. The very mystery of the pie's contents became a part of its identity. The famous fictional character of the era, Sweeney Todd, the demon barber who murdered his clients and had them baked into pies by his accomplice Mrs. Lovett, was not a random invention. He was a manifestation of a very real, very widespread public anxiety about what was in their food. The story resonated because everyone who had ever eaten a cheap meat pie had, at some point, had the same dark thought cross their mind. You take another bite of your pie. Is the soft morsel you just swallowed mutton or eel, or something you'd rather not contemplate? The heavy seasoning is a form of censorship, deliberately preventing you from knowing the truth. You are eating blind, trusting a system that has given you every reason not to trust it. The gravy, thick and heavy, fills your stomach, creating a comforting sensation of fullness. It's a trick. Of course, the gravy is mostly flour and water. The pastry is cheap lard and flour, and the meat is a mystery. You are filling up on stark suspicion. You finish the pie, down to the last greasy crumb. You don't feel nourished. You feel ballasted, weighed down. The initial comfort of the heat has faded, leaving you with a familiar, low-level queasiness. You have successfully eaten. You have survived another meal, but the psychological cost is mounting. The constant second-guessing, the faint, lingering tastes of things you can't identify, the dark jokes that hide a real fear, it all chips away at you. As you stand up, wiping your greasy hands on your trousers, you notice a different kind of street vendor nearby. one with a bubbling pot over a charcoal brazier. HES selling something that requires no disguise, no pastry, no gravy. It's an honest, straightforward food, fished directly from the city's great Dog River. Your curiosity, or perhaps your morbid desire to find just one thing that is exactly what it claims to be, draws you toward the vendor with the bubbling pot. The smell is aquatic, fishy, but with the unmistakable undertone of the river it came from a muddy, slightly metallic scent. The vendor is selling hot eels. He skillfully lifts a writhing, slippery creature from a bucket, chops it into sections with a cleaver, and drops them into the boiling water. After a few moments, he fishes out the cooked pieces and serves them in a small bowl with a splash of vinegar. This is one of the most iconic and most stomach-turning street foods of Victorian London. You watch a customer, a young boy with a sooty face, slurp down a piece of the eel, his eyes closed in a moment of simple, creature-like pleasure. It's cheap, it's hot, and it's undeniably protein. You decide to try it. For a halfpenny, you get a few pale, boiled sections of eel in a chipped ceramic bowl. You take a piece. The texture is soft, slightly gelatinous, and the flesh comes away from the central bone easily. You dip it in the vinegar provided, which is sharp and cleansing, and take a bite. The taste is surprisingly mild. It's not overly fishy, but it does taste distinctly of the river muddy, earthy, a flavor that is both food and landscape. It's not delicious, but it is deeply, fundamentally real. There is no deception here. You are eating an eel from the Thames, and that is precisely the problem. The eel was one of the few creatures that could not only survive, but thrive in the grotesquely polluted water of the Industrial Revolution's main artery. The Thames of your time is a chemical sewer. It's choked with the raw sewage of millions of people, toxic effluent from factories, waste from gasworks, and runoff from cemeteries. It is, for all intents and purposes, biologically dead. Most fish have long since vanished, but not the eel. Eels are famously hardy scavengers. They could tolerate the low oxygen levels and feast on the rich organic sludge that carpeted the riverbed. They were, in essence, bioaccumulators. They were turning the city's filth into flesh. So when you eat that piece of eel, you are consuming a concentrated dose of the Thames. You are eating the sewage, the industrial waste, the cholera bacteria, all conveniently packaged in a slippery, edible form. Here's a small, weird fact that underscores the resilience eels were sometimes found living in the city's water pipes. There are documented accounts from the period of eels slithering out of domestic water taps, having swum up from the river through the intake pipes and navigated the labyrinth of the city's water mains. Imagine turning the tap for a drink and having a live eel splash into your cup. It's a testament to their incredible ability to survive in the most unnatural of environments. The historical debate around eels isn't about whether people ate them. They absolutely did, in vast quantities. The question is how aware they were of the specific dangers. Again, this comes back to the lack of germ theory. The eel, standing there eating the eel, might worry that the taste of the mud is unpleasant, or that the smell of the river is unhealthy. The miasma theory. You would not understand that the true danger lies in the invisible cholera and typhoid bacteria teeming within the eel's flesh. The boiling process would have killed many of them, thankfully, but cross-contamination was rampant, and the eels themselves were still saturated with heavy metals and chemical toxins from factory runoff. Eating eels was a part of the city's culture. Jellied eels, where the boiled eel pieces are allowed to cool in their own gelatinous stock, became a London delicacy that persists to this day, a relic of a time when the city had to eat what it could get. For you, it's not a delicacy, it's a calorie source. It's a transaction. You are exchanging a halfpenny for a few grams of protein, and in return, you are taking a calculated risk with your long-term health. You finish your portion of eel. The vinegar has washed away some of the muddy taste, but it lingers, The meal leaves you with a strange feeling. On the one hand, you feel a sense of relief. For the first time all day, you have eaten something that wasn't a lie. It wasn't pretending to be something it wasn't. It was an eel from a filthy river, and it tasted exactly like an eel from a filthy river. There's a grim honesty to it that the painted cheese and shaggy bread lacked. On the other hand, the knowledge of where it came from is deeply unsettling. You have now consumed the city as water, its fraudulent solids, and now its living waste. You are, piece by piece, becoming a part of this grimy ecosystem. As you hand the empty bowl back to the vendor, you notice another street food stall nearby, selling something even more basic, something that seems stripped down to the bare essentials of bone and gristle. Your culinary tour of the London streets is not over yet. Your stomach, now a confused repository of chemical bread, mystery pie, and river eel, is full but not satisfied. You are fueled, but not nourished. As you wander away from the eel vendor, you encounter a different, less aromatic stall. The sign is simple boiled sheep's trotters. On the counter, in a tray of lukewarm, cloudy water, are dozens of pale, almost skeletal-looking sheep's feet. This is street food at its most primal. There is no attempt at disguise, no pastry, no sauce beyond the murky water they sit in. It is a boiled body part, plain and simple. The vendor, a woman with a perpetually tired expression, dishes one out for a customer, who simply takes it, sits on a nearby crate, then begins to gnaw on it. The process is slow and laborious, a dedicated effort to extract every last shred of meat and gelatin from between the tiny bones. You watch, fascinated and slightly repulsed. This isn't a meal, it's a project. Yet, it is undeniably popular. For the price of a single penny, you get something that can occupy you for a good half hour and provides a tiny, yet valuable, amount of protein and fat. You decide against trying one yourself. The sight of the pale, wrinkled skin and the exposed knuckles is a little too much for your already tested stomach. But you stand and observe this ritual of poverty. Sheep's trotters were a classic example of nose-to-tail eating, born not of culinary philosophy, but of grim necessity. In an era where no part of an animal could be wasted, the fat, which the wealthy would discard, became a staple for the poor. They were boiled for hours to break down the tough, connective tissues and make the skin and tendons edible. What you were eating was almost entirely skin, sinew, and gelatin. There was very little actual muscle meat on a trotter. The appeal was twofold. First, they were incredibly cheap. They were a byproduct of the much more lucrative wool and mutton trades. Second, the act of eating them was time-consuming. This was a feature, not a bug. For a person with a gnawing, empty stomach, a food that takes a long time to eat provides a psychological distraction from hunger. It makes a very small amount of food feel more substantial. You couldn't just swallow a trotter, you had to work for it. And that work filled the empty minutes of a life that had too many of them. Here's a small, strange detail about the street food scene: the sheer variety of awful and strange cuts that were considered normal fare. Alongside sheep's trotters, you could buy faggots, balls of minced organ meat, usually pork, mixed with bread and herbs, save lois, a type of bright red, heavily seasoned sausage, and baked potatoes, which were often the most wholesome thing on offer. You could also buy pea soup from vendors who would walk around with a can of hot soup, shouting hot pea soup. A customer would hold out their own bowl or cup to be filled. The air of the slums was a constant cacophony of these competing food calls. The historical debate around these foods isn't about their existence, but about their role in the social fabric. Were they simply desperation foods, eaten only when nothing else was available, or did they form a genuine cuisine of the poor, with its own standards, traditions, and even a sense of community? Some social historians argue for the latter, pointing out that these street vendors were central figures in their neighborhoods. They were a source of hot food for people who had no cooking facilities of their own. They were a place to gather, to exchange gossip, to feel, for a moment, a part of something. The food might be grim, but the social function was vital. As you watch the man diligently working on his trotter, you see other people eating food they've brought themselves. A woman sits on a step, slowly eating a cold, boiled potato. A group of children are sharing a single apple, each taking a small, precise bite. And everywhere, there is bread. That same, dense, suspiciously white bread, the foundation upon which all these other meager meals are built. This observation leads you to a profound realization. The diet of the London poor wasn't just monotonous, it was almost entirely starch-based. Meat, in any form, was a rare treat. Even the dubious spy or the river eel was an occasional luxury. The day-to-day reality for the vast majority of people in this part of the city was a relentless cycle of bread and potatoes. They were the cheapest, most filling calories available. They filled the stomach and provided the raw energy to work a 14-hour day in a factory. But they provided little else. The chronic lack of vitamins, protein, and essential fats led to a population plagued by malnourishment, stunted growth, and a host of deficiency-related diseases. You turn away from the trotter's stall, the image of the knot on bones seared into your mind. You've explored the deceptions and the grim realities of the city's prepared foods. But now you understand the baseline. The true taste of poverty isn't the chemical tang of adulterated tea or the muddy flavor of eel. It's the profound, soul-crushing blandness of a diet consisting of almost nothing but the cheapest possible starches. And in this world of lies and tricks, there is one food item that is, perhaps, the most honest of them all. Your most reliable, if most boring, friend, the potato. After a day spent navigating a minefield of culinary deception, you find yourself craving simplicity, not pleasure, not even flavor, but predictability. Your journey through the London foodscape has taught you that complexity is a cover for fraud. The more ingredients in a food, the more opportunities for it to be fake. This logic leads you to the most humble offenders, the baked potato man. He stands on a street corner with a magnificent, portable oven made of polished tin, a contraption known as a potato can. A small charcoal fire inside keeps a batch of potatoes perpetually hot. The smell is wonderful, the clean, earthy, comforting scent of baked potato. There are no hidden ingredients, no mysterious gravies, no chemical dyes. It is simply a potato. You hand over your penny, a standard price for a large one. The vendor, using a thick cloth to protect his hands, pulls a huge potato from the hot drawer of the can. It's perfect, the skin is dark and slightly crispy, and when he splits it open with a knife, a cloud of pure white steam erupts. He asks if you want butter and pepper. You've learned your lesson about the butter, so you shake your head. Just the pepper, you say. He gives a generous shake from a tin, and hands you the steaming hot tuber. You cradle it in your hands. The heat is intense. The welcome, honest warmth that seeps into your cold fingers. You find a place to sit and take your first bite. The flesh is fluffy, hard, and floury. The taste is simple, clean, and deeply satisfying. It's not exciting. It's not a delicacy, but it's real. After a day of eating lies, the sheer, unadulterated honesty of a potato is an emotional relief. The potato was, alongside bread, the co-monarch of the working class diet. It was cheap to grow, calorie-dense, and versatile. Crucially, it was almost impossible to adulterate. A potato was a potato. You couldn't easily add fillers or chemicals to it. You couldn't fake it. A consumer could judge its quality simply by looking at it. This made it a deeply trusted food source. When every other food was suspect, the potato was a bastion of integrity. The baked potato, sold on the street, was more than just food, it was a public service. The potato cans, which first appeared in the early 19th century, were a marvel of street-level technology. They kept the potatoes hot for hours, providing a warm, Nutritious meal for people who had no access to ovens or even basic cooking facilities. For a factory worker coming off a long shift, a hot-baked potato was a small miracle. It was fast, cheap, and filling. It was the perfect industrial era food. Here's a small, weird fact about the potatoes roll. It was also a hand warmer. On a bitter winter's day, people would buy a hot potato not just to eat, but to hold in their pockets for a while. A small, edible furnace to bring some life back into their frozen hands before they finally ate it. It was a multi-purpose tool for survival. However, the reliance on this single crop was a double-edged sword. While the potato was honest, a diet consisting almost solely of potatoes and bread was dangerously monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. This is where historians debate the true quality of life for the urban poor. Was a full stomach from potatoes in a London slum better than a periodically empty one in the countryside they'd left behind economically? Perhaps, but nutritionally, it was a disaster. The lack of vitamins, especially vitamin C and varied proteins, led to widespread, low-level scurvy, rickets in children, and a general state of poor health and low energy known as lassitude. You weren't acutely sick, but you weren't ever truly well. The absolute dependence on the potato also held a terrifying risk, as had been so brutally demonstrated in Ireland in the 1840s. A failure of the potato crop due to blight could plunge this already precarious population into genuine starvation. While England's food supply was more diverse than Ireland's, a spike in potato prices could still be catastrophic for a family living on the edge. You finish your potato, scraping the last bit of fluffy flesh from the inside of the skin. You even chew on the skin itself, not wanting to waste a single calorie. For the first time all day, your stomach feels settled. The simple, honest starch has calmed the queasy unrest caused by the chemical cocktail of your earlier meals. You feel a sense of clarity. You understand the rules of the game now. Survival is about finding the simplest, most unadulterated foods possible. It's about accepting a diet of mind, numbing monotony in exchange for a degree of safety. The blandness of the potato is the price you pay for its honesty. Your brief moment of peace is interrupted by the sight of a group of children crowded around a sweets shop window. Their faces are pressed against the glass, staring at a vibrant display of colorful candies. The bright reds, greens, and yellows are dazzling in the great twilight. In a world so devoid of color and pleasure, the appeal is magnetic. Surely, you think, a small piece of candy, a tiny bit of sugar, can't be that bad. Drawn by an almost primal urge for a taste of sweetness, for a flash of color in this monochrome world, you drift towards the sweet shop. The window is a treasure chest of temptations. There are striped humbugs, brightly colored lozenges, and glistening boiled sweets in glass jars. They seem to glow with an inner light, promising a burst of pure, childish joy. For children who lived on a diet of bland starches and whose world was painted in shades of gray and brown, these vibrant colors were utterly mesmerizing. You see a mother buying a small bag of vivid green sweets for her child. The little girl's face lights up with an incandescent joy that is both beautiful and heartbreaking to watch. You decide you've earned a small indulgence. You go into the shop, which smells overwhelmingly of sugar and something faintly chemical, and buy a single, bright red lozenge for a half-penny. It's beautiful, like a small, polished jewel. You pop it into your mouth. The sweetness is immediate and intense, a shocking and delightful contrast to the day's savory and starchy fare. But as it dissolves, a strange, metallic, and slightly painful taste begins to develop on your tongue. It's the same hot, biting sensation you vaguely recall from the painted cheese, but much more intense. You have just treated yourself to a confection colored with sulfide of mercury. The beautiful green sweets you saw the little girl eating were likely colored with chillas grain, a pigment containing arsenic. The world of 19th century confectionery was, without exaggeration, a gallery of poisons. Sugar was expensive, so the sweets were often bulked up with cheaper substances, like plaster of Paris or chalk, the same fillers you found in your bread. But the real danger was in the colors. The public demanded bright, vibrant sweets, and the confectioners, who were completely unregulated, turned to their local chemist or even hardware store for pigments. They weren't using food colorings, they were using industrial and artists' dyes, chosen for their brilliance and low cost, with absolutely no regard for their toxicity. The list of coloring agents, as documented by reformers like Arthur Hill Hassel, reads like a poison arrest shopping list. That brilliant red on your lozenge could be reed lead or cinnabar mercury sulfide. The bright yellows were often lead chromat or gambo GE. The vivid blues came from Prussian blue or indigo. And the greens, a popular color for sweets, were the most dangerous of all. They were typically made with copper arsenite, Chiz green, or a similar compound called Brunswick green. These were potent arsenic compounds. A single sweet might not kill a person outright, but the poisons were cumulative. For children who regularly spent their pennies on these colorful treats, it was a slow and insidious process. The lead would lead to developmental delays and neurological damage. The mercury could cause tremors and madness, and the arsenic could cause chronic pain, digestive issues, and a slow, wasting death. There are documented cases from the period of children dying from acute poisoning after eating a large quantity of these sweets, which they had perhaps been given as a special treat. Here's a small, weirdly specific detail about this trade. Some of the most dangerous sweets were the ones designed to be ornamental. Cake toppers, little sugar figures, and decorative leaves were often made almost entirely of plaster and painted with the most vibrant and therefore most toxic paints, because they were not really intended to be eaten. But of course, children ate them. A beautiful green sugar leaf on a birthday cake could deliver a significant dose of arsenic. Historians are still horrified by the sheer recklessness of this practice. The debate is not whether it happened, but how it was allowed to happen. How could a society permit the open, widespread poisoning of its own children for profit? The answer lies in a combination of ignorance, greed, and a deep-seated belief in laissez-faire capitalism. The government had no role in regulating what a private citizen chose to put in their product. The idea of consumer protection did not exist. The burden of safety was entirely on the consumer, and the consumer in this case. Often a child was drawn to the pretty colors with no possible way of knowing the danger. You quickly spit the half-dissolved lozenge out of your mouth, the metallic taste now coating your entire palate. The brief moment of sweet pleasure has curdled into fear. You look at the innocent-looking sweet, now a sticky reed mess on the cobblestones, and you see it for what it is, a brightly colored lie, a lure hiding a hook. It's perhaps the most cynical deception of all, targeting the most vulnerable and their innate desire for a small bit of beauty and sweetness. The sugar rush has been replaced by a rush of adrenaline. You feel a sudden, desperate need to escape, to numb your senses, to blot out the constant, grinding anxiety of being slowly poisoned. The day has been a relentless assault on your body and your trust. Your mind turns to the one place designed for exactly this kind of escape, the gin palace. Surely, the drink could wash all this away. The day's accumulated horror, the grit in the bread, the lead in the cheese, the arsenic in the candy sits in your soul like a toxic sludge. You crave oblivion, or at least a temporary anesthetic for the mind. The answer looms on a nearby corner, glowing with a gas-lit grandiosity that seems absurd in this grimy neighborhood, a gin palace. It's nothing like a simple pub. It's an explosion of polished mahogany, ornate mirrors, and glittering gas lamps. The goal is to create an illusion of warmth, wealth, and escape, to lure you in from the cold, dark streets. You push through the swinging doors and are hit by a wall of sound, loud laughter, boisterous arguments, and the clinking of glasses. The air is thick with the smell of cheap perfume, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, botanical scent of gin. You make your way to the long bar. You don't have much money left, but gin is cheap, infamously cheap. You order a glass of Blue Ruin, the popular nickname for the spirit. The bartender, with swift, practiced motions, pours a measure of clear liquid into a glass. You hand over your coin, take the glass, and retreat to a corner. You take a sip. It's harsh, fiery, and burns all the way down. The botanical notes of juniper are there, but they're muddled, fighting against a raw, chemical taste. There's also a strange, lingering sweetness and a fiery bite that seems out of proportion to its alcoholic strength. It does the job, though. A warmth spreads through your chest, and the sharp edges of your anxiety begin to soften. You take another drink. You are, of course, drinking yet another adulterated product. The idea that you could escape the world of fraud by entering a gin palace is, perhaps, the most bitter irony of all. The gin and beer served to the poor were just as systematically tampered with as their food. The gin in your glass is likely a far cry from properly distilled London Dry. The base was often a cheap, crudely distilled spirit, raw and harsh, to save money on the expensive botanical flavorings like juniper berries. Publicans would create a chemical cocktail to mimic the taste. The most important additive was oil of turpentine. A few drops would give the raw spirit a pungent, juniper-like aroma to replicate the hot sensation of strong alcohol. They would add cayenne pepper or grains of paradise, a West African spice with a fiery kick. This gave the illusion of high proof, making you think you were getting more for your money, and a sweetness that was often achieved by adding sugar. But the truly signature adulterant for gin was oil of vitriol, what we now call sulfuric acid. A tiny, carefully measured amount would add a specific kind of sharp, acidic bite that drinkers came to associate with good gin. So your Blue Ruin is a concoction of cheap alcohol, turpentine, pepper, and sulfuric acid. It was a recipe for liver failure and chronic gastritis, but it was cheap, and it was effective at its primary goal, getting people drunk as quickly as possible. The other staple drink, was no better. Brewers were masters of frugality. They used less malt and hops, the expensive ingredients, and made up for it with other substances to give the beer a bitter, hoppy flavor. They might use quassia, a bitterwood extract, or even strychnine in minute, non-lethal but still harmful quantities, to give it a frothy, appealing head. They would add copperas or ferrous sulfate. This is the same chemical you might have heard of being used in the dyeing and textile industries, and to give a sense of intoxicating power to weak beer, some publicans would add Cocculus indicus, a toxic berry containing a convulsant poison that could produce a stupefying, drunken-like state. Here's a weird fact of the pub trade: the publican's own equipment was often part of the problem. Beer was frequently served from lead-lined pipes. Over time, the acidic beer would leach lead from the pipes, slowly poisoning the regular customers. This is one of those historical debates where cause and effect get murky. Did the lead poisoning contribute to the social problems blamed on alcoholism? Or was it the other way around? It was likely a vicious cycle of chemical and social poison. You take another sip of your acid-laced gin. The world is beginning to blur at the edges, which is exactly what you wanted. The noise of the gin palace is fading into a dull roar. The faces around you seem less menacing. The anxiety in your gut is being replaced by a warm, fuzzy indifference. It works. The escape is real, for a little while. But you understand now that there is no escape. The system of deception is total. It's in your bread, your milk, your meat, and now, in your anesthetic. The city doesn't just poison your body. With its food, it sells you a different poison to help you forget. It's a closed, perfect loop of exploitation. The temporary warmth of the gin begins to fade, and a familiar, sour acidity rises in your throat. It's a reminder that even your escape comes at a chemical cost. You know you can't stay here. You need to get back to whatever miserable corner you've rented for the night. As you stumble out into the street, the cold air hits you like a slap. Your mind, fuzzy as it is, drifts to one last category of food. The condiments, the pickles and sauces. Perhaps a splash of something sharp and green could liven up tomorrow's sad meal. You stumble through the dark streets, the fiery gins lashing unpleasantly in your stomach. The brief, fuzzy escape it offered is already curdling into a familiar, low-grade nausea. Your thoughts, now slow and syrupy, drift towards tomorrow's meal. It will be bread, of course, the same sad, heavy loaf. Maybe, you think, you can make it more interesting. A bit of pickle, perhaps something sharp and sour to cut through the monotony. The next day, with a dull headache pounding behind your eyes, you seek out a grocer's shop. There on the shelf are jars of pickled onions and gherkins, sitting in a murky brine. But what catches your eye is a jar of pickled illy or a similar mixed pickle. The vegetables inside cauliflower, onions, cucumbers, are suspended in a yellowish sauce. But what's truly remarkable is the color of the gherkins. They are a brilliant, almost jewel-like green. A green that seems too vibrant, too perfect to be natural. In a world of brown and gray, this splash of color is an irresistible promise of flavor and freshness. It speaks of summer gardens and crisp vegetables. You buy a small scoop of the mixed pickles, the grocer fishing them out of the big jar and plopping them onto a piece of paper for you. You can't wait to get back to your room to try them. Later, you sit with your piece of chalky bread and your brightly colored pickles. You spear a piece of the unnaturally green gherk and bite into it. The crunch is satisfying, and the taste is intensely sour from the vinegar. But underneath the soreness, there's that same, faint, metallic tang you've come to recognize as the city's signature flavor. A taste that doesn't belong. You are eating a pickle that has been greened with copper. The art of pickling was yet another field ripe for dangerous adulteration. The public associated a bright, vivid green with fresh, high-quality pickled vegetables. Naturally pickled cucumbers, however, tend to turn a dull, olive green color, which was seen as unappetizing. To achieve the prized, jewel-like green, pickle manufacturers would boil their vinegar in copper vessels. Sometimes, they would go a step further and simply add a copper salt, like copper sulfate, also known as blue vitriol, directly to the brine. The acidic vinegar would react with the copper, forming copper acetate, which would then be absorbed by the vegetables, giving them that beautiful, but toxic, green sheen. Copper is a heavy metal poison. In small, regular doses, it causes severe gastrointestinal distress, leading to vomiting, stomach cramps, and eventually damage to the liver and kidneys. The sharp, metallic taste you detect is the taste of the copper itself. This practice was shockingly widespread and brazen. The pickle makers weren't exactly hiding it. In fact, they advertised the vibrant color of their products as a mark of quality. Here's a bizarre detail from the period. A common household tip for women doing their own pickling was to boil a penny coin with their cucumbers to ensure a lovely green color. The penny, being made of copper, would leach into the brine and have the same effect. This wasn't seen as poisoning your family. It was seen as good housekeeping, a trick for making your food look more appealing. Historians often use this penny in the pickle jar anecdote to illustrate a crucial point. The line between folk knowledge and dangerous practice was incredibly blurry. Without a scientific understanding of toxicology, aesthetic qualities, like color, were the primary way people judged food. A bright green pickle looked healthier than a dull olive one, so the method used to achieve that color was considered a positive innovation, not a dangerous adulteration. The debate isn't whether they knew copper was involved, but whether they understood the physiological consequences of ingesting it. The evidence suggests a profound, society-wide ignorance on the matter. And it wasn't just pickles. The same logic applied to sauces and ketchup. That bright red bottle of tomato ketchup. It was often made from little to no tomato. The base might be pumpkin, or apple pulp, bulked up with fillers, and then colored with cochineal, a harmless insect dye if you're lucky, or, more commonly and cheaply, with ferric oxide rust. That sharp, savory flavor often came not from spices, but from a carefully balanced cocktail of vinegars and acids. You look at the pickle in your hand. It's another beautiful lie. The tiny, green, crunchy, copper-laced lie. It was supposed to be a small improvement, a little splash of flavor to make a bleak meal more bearable. But instead, it's just one more source of poison. One more thing to worry about. The cumulative effect of all these small betrayals is taking its toll. It's not just in your head anymore. You can feel it in your body. The city isn't just a place you live in, it's a substance you are ingesting, and your body is beginning to protest. It starts as a whisper, a low, persistent grumble in your gut that never quite goes away. At first, you dismiss it as hunger, or the result of one particularly dubious meal, but it doesn't fade. It becomes the new normal, a constant, dull ache deep in your abdomen. This is the beginning of your body's protest. You wake up in the morning feeling sluggish, a profound weariness in your bones that sleep has touched. Your joints ache, and there's a metallic taste in your mouth that no amount of that gray river water can wash away. You feel perpetually bloated, and your digestion is a chaotic mess of constipation from the alum-moist bread, followed by sudden, cramping bouts of diarrhea from whatever contaminated water or meat you consumed. This isn't a specific illness you can point to, it's a state of being, a chronic, low-level sickness that saps your strength and your will. You are experiencing what was the common lot of the London poor, slow, systematic poisoning by your own diet. Each adulterant you've consumed is playing its part. The almond chalk in the bread are inflaming the lining of your stomach and intestines, leading to chronic gastritis. This makes it harder for your body to absorb what few nutrients are present in your food, creating a vicious cycle of malnutrition. You're eating, but you're starving on a cellular level. The heavy metals are staging a silent, insidious invasion. The lead from the cheese, the water pipes, and the candy is beginning to accumulate in your tissues. You might notice your gums developing a faint, dark line along the edges, a classic sign of lead poisoning known as the Burtonian line. You feel irritable. Your memory isn't as sharp as it used to be, and you suffer from headaches that pound with the rhythm of the city's factories. The copper from the pickles is adding to the assault on your digestive system, contributing to the constant nausea and stomach pain. If you were a child, these poisons would be stunting your growth, both physically and mentally. If you were a factory worker, this constant state of ill health would make you less efficient, more prone to accidents, and more likely to be fired. Your very survival depends on your physical strength, and your food is systematically destroying it. Here's a small, grim fact about the medical understanding of the time. If you were to go to a doctor which you could barely afford complaining of these symptoms, they would likely be diagnosed as dyspepsia or a nervous complaint. The doctor, subscribing to the miasma theory, might advise you to seek out cleaner air or to avoid unwholesome vapors. They would be unlikely to make the direct connection between your specific food intake and your specific symptoms. The science to do so is still in its infancy. You would be treated for the symptoms, perhaps with medicines that were themselves adulterated, while the root cause continued unabated with every meal. The historical debate here is a difficult one. How do we quantify this suffering? We can read the statistics on mortality rates and life expectancy, which were abysmal in these neighborhoods, but that doesn't capture the daily, grinding reality of living with chronic pain and fatigue. Some optimistic economic historians have argued that, while the conditions were terrible, the wages and opportunities in the city were still an improvement over a rural life teetering on the edge of starvation. But revisionist social historians counter that this view ignores the profound decline in the quality of life, the loss of access to fresh air, clean water, and wholesome food. What good is a slightly higher wage if it only buys you food that makes you too sick to work? You look at your own reflection in a grimy puddle. The face staring back at you is pale, the eyes are dull, and there are dark circles beneath them. You are thinner than when you arrived, but your stomach is bloated. You are a living testament to the London diet. Your body has become a battlefield where cheap calories war against actual nutrition, and where profit margins fight against your long-term health. This physical decline breeds a specific kind of despair. It's a feeling of being trapped inside a failing machine. You begin to understand that the city doesn't just demand your labor, it demands your health. It consumes it, slowly, meal by meal, as fuel for its own relentless growth. You are a disposable component, easily replaced by the next hopeful soul arriving from the countryside. The pain and weakness are a constant reminder of your powerlessness. You can't afford the pure food. You can't escape the contaminated water. You are a captive consumer in a market designed to exploit you. This realization can lead to one of two places: resignation or rage. For now, it's a wary, cynical resignation. You start to wonder, how does it all work? How does the baker get his chalk? Or the pickle maker his copper? You begin to peer behind the curtain to see the machinery of this great deception. Your weary cynicism evolves into a kind of morbid curiosity. How is this grand illusion sustained? You start paying closer attention, not just to the food itself, but to the ecosystem that produces it. You begin to notice the quiet transactions in the back alleys, the strange deliveries made to the grocer's shop at odd hours. One day, you catch a glimpse into the back room of the bakery, and you see the wisdom of the cheating merchant laid bare. It's not a scene of cartoonish villainy with a baker gleefully cackling as he pours poison into the dough. It's far more mundane, and therefore more chilling. It's a workshop. In one corner, you see sacks of low-grade, grayish flour. Next to them are other, unmarked sacks. One contains a fine, white powder that you now know is chalk or plaster. Another holds a crystalline substance, the alum. There's a large barrel of potatoes in the corner, and a grinding tool. It's a workstation organized for efficiency, a small-scale factory for producing fraudulent bread. The baker isn't a monster, he is a craftsman, and his craft is adulteration. He sees these ingredients not as food and non-food, but simply as inputs. Flour is an input, alum is an input, water is an input. His goal is to find the cheapest combination of inputs to produce an output that looks and feels like bread and can be sold for a profit. Morality doesn't enter into the equation. It's a matter of pure, unsentimental economics. You start to see this logic everywhere. You see the milkman stop at the parish pump, his large churns on his cart, and spend a good 10 minutes working the handle, diluting his product in plain sight. It's not a shameful secret, it's just part of his morning routine. You see the tea merchant's apprentice sweeping the dusty floor of the warehouse, carefully collecting the spilt tea leaves and debris into a separate pile. Nothing is wasted. This leads you to discover a whole shadow economy. There are businesses that don't sell food at all, but sell adulterants. You might see a cart delivering a load of logwood chips to the tea seller, or a man with a wheelbarrow full of what looks like reddish dirt delivering to the ketchup maker. There were druggists who specialized in selling these substances to the food trade. They would sell almond copperas to the bakers and brewers, reed lead to the cheesemongers, and oil of vitriol to the gin palaces. These suppliers were the arms dealers in the war on public health. Here's a weirdly specific and telling detail about the trade. Some of these adulterants were old, undercoated, euphemistic names. Alum and salt used by bakers might be sold as baker's stuff or rock stuff. The toxic Berrycoculus indicus, used to give beer a fake intoxicating power, was simply called multum. This linguistic trick served two purposes. It created a veil of professional jargon, making the process seem like a legitimate, skilled trade, and it provided a thin layer of plausible deniability. The baker could claim he didn't know exactly what was in the stuff he was buying, he just knew it made his bread white and heavy, as his customers demanded. The historical debate here touches on the nature of guilt in such a system. Who was truly to blame? Was it the individual grocer who added a bit of chalk to his milk, or the wholesaler who supplied him, or the chemical manufacturer who produced the chalk knowing its intended use, or the government that refused to regulate any of them, or even the consumer who, through their demand for the whitest bread and the greenest pickles, inadvertently encouraged these practices? The uncomfortable truth is that it was a systemic failure, a chain of cynical decisions made at every level, where each participant could point to the next as the real problem. You see that the shopkeeper is a prisoner of the system, just as you are. If you were to sell an honest loaf of bread, made from pure, high-quality flour, it would be darker, smaller, and more expensive than his competitors. His customers, conditioned to see white and heavy as good, would abandon him. To be an honest merchant in this environment was to commit commercial suicide. So, he cheats to survive, just as you risk your health to survive. This peek behind the curtain is disillusioning in a new way. You had imagined, perhaps, a conspiracy of evil men. The reality is much worse. It's a conspiracy of ordinary, desperate men, all making rational economic decisions within a deeply irrational and immoral system. The adulteration isn't an anomaly, it's the logical outcome of the city's core principles: profit above all else, he the tempter, let the buyer beware, and a complete disregard for the long-term consequences. You now understand the how. The mechanics of the fraud are clear, but the bigger question remains: why is this allowed to happen on such a massive industrial scale? Why does no one stop it? The answer lies not in the back room of a bakery, but in the halls of power and the very philosophy that built this city. Your understanding of the problem has deepened. It's not about a few bad apples, it's about the entire orchard. The question of why this is happening echoes in your mind as you walk the crowded streets. The answer is all around you, in the very fabric of the city. It's in the smoke billowing from the factory chimneys, the frantic pace of the crowds, and the stark, shocking contrast between the opulent carriages of the rich and the desperate poverty of the alleys. The fundamental reason for your poisonous diet is the unprecedented, explosive growth of the city itself. London has become a magnet, pulling in hundreds of thousands of people like you from the countryside. This massive, sudden urbanization has completely overwhelmed the old systems of food production and distribution. The traditional model of local farms supplying a nearby town is broken. Now, food has to be transported over long distances, stored for longer periods, and distributed through a complex chain of middlemen. Every step in that chain is an opportunity for delay, for spoilage, and for fraud. The city is a hungry beast, and its appetite is insatiable. The sheer volume of food required on a daily basis is staggering. This pressure creates a powerful incentive to stretch resources by any means necessary. Adding water to milk, alum to bread, or potato to cheese isn't just about greed from a certain grim perspective. It's about making a limited food supply go further. It's a warped, toxic form of efficiency, a response to a logistical crisis. Then there is the issue of anonymity. In the small village you came from, the baker, the miller, and the farmer were your neighbors. You knew them. They had a reputation to uphold. If the baker sold you a bad loaf, the whole village would know by sundown. Social pressure was a powerful, informal regulator. Here, in the vast, impersonal metropolis, you are a faceless customer buying from a faceless vendor. The man who sells you the pie doesn't know your name and will likely never see you again. The social contract is shattered, replaced by fleeting, anonymous transactions where the only thing that matters is the exchange of a coin. The core of the problem, however, is philosophical. The prevailing ideology of the era is laissez-faire. The French term meaning let it be. It's the belief that the government should not interfere in the free market. The market, according to this theory, will regulate itself through the natural laws of supply and demand. If a baker sells bad bread, customers will simply go to another baker, and the bad baker will go out of business. It's a neat, elegant theory that has absolutely no connection to the reality of your life. You can't choose another baker because they are all playing the same game. You lack the information to make an informed choice. You can't see the alum in the bread or the copper in the pickles. And you lack the power to demand better because your choice is between bad food and no food at all. The free market, for the poor, is not a market of choices, it's a market of compulsions. Here's a small, weird fact that illustrates the absurdity of this non-interventionist stance for a long time. The only significant legal precedent for punishing food adulterators in England was an ancient law from the 13th century called the Assize of Bredendale. It was designed for a medieval village, not an industrial metropolis. It was completely inadequate for tackling the sophisticated, chemical-based fraud of your time. For centuries, as the problem grew, the legal framework remained frozen in the past. This is a major point of debate for historians. Was the lack of regulation a result of genuine ideological belief in laissez-faire, or was it a convenient excuse used to protect the interests of powerful manufacturers and merchants who benefited from the status quo? The truth is likely a combination of both. Many politicians and intellectuals genuinely believed that government intervention would be a slippery slope, harming business and ultimately hurting the economy. At the same time, industrial and commercial interests had powerful lobbies that actively fought against any attempt to introduce meaningful regulation. So you are trapped in a perfect storm. A city growing too fast, a food system stretched to its breaking point, the anonymity of urban life, and a dominant political philosophy that champions non-interference as a virtue. The result is a Wild West of food production, where the only law is profit and the sheriff is looking the other way. This understanding is profoundly disheartening. Your suffering is not an accident. It is a predictable, even necessary, byproduct of the age you live in. You are not just a victim of a crooked baker, you are a victim of an entire system of economic and political thought. The chalk in your bread is the physical manifestation of a political philosophy. As you digest this grim realization, you start to hear a different kind of talk on the streets. Not everyone is accepting this as normal. You hear whispers of a new kind of thinking, a radical idea that maybe, just maybe, people have a right to know what's in their food. This isn't just a matter of individual choice, it's a matter of public health. The slow, grinding acceptance of your fate begins to be punctuated by sparks of dissent. You start to notice them in small places. In a pub, you overhear a heated argument where one man, red-faced with anger, throws down a piece of bread and yells, "It's more stone than flour. Are we just meant to eat rocks now?" Or you see a woman at the market, shouting at a grocer, accusing him of selling her sour, watered-down milk that made her child sick. These are small, isolated acts of defiance, but they are happening. You might pick up a discarded newspaper and see a letter to the editor, a furious tirade from a citizen complaining about the poisonous sweets being sold to children. You read pamphlets, cheap single-sheet prints passed from hand to hand, that mock the city's bakers and brewers in satirical cartoons and angry poems. A new consciousness is stirring, a slow, dawning realization that this is not an acceptable state of affairs. What's truly shocking to you is the defense offered by the merchants themselves when they are confronted. You might witness one of these arguments firsthand. The baker, cornered by an angry customer, doesn't deny using alum. Instead, he defends it. "It's what the people want," he might say, wiping his furry hands on his apron. "They want a white loaf, a heavy loaf. I'm just giving them what they ask for. It's not my fault if pure flour doesn't look the part." This is a common and powerful argument blaming the victim. The merchants claim they are merely responding to consumer demand. The public wants bright green pickles, so they provide bright green pickles. The public wants fiery gin, so they provide fiery gin. The methods are just trade secrets, a necessary means to a desired end. Then you hear the economic argument. If I made it with pure flour, the baker might continue, gesturing around his humble shop, the price would be so high, none of you could afford it. You'd be out of business, and you'd have no bread at all. Am I supposed to let you starve? This is just business. It's how it's done. This line of reasoning is a masterclass in moral jujitsu. The adulterator Ray frames himself as a public benefactor, a savvy businessman who is using his skills to make essential goods affordable for the poor. The chalk and alum are no longer fraudulent fillers, they are economic necessities, a form of subsidy. It's an argument that is both completely self-serving and devilishly difficult to refute when you are living on the edge of starvation. Here's a small, weird fact that captures the pervasiveness of this mindset. The concept of adulteration was often seen as a legitimate part of an apprentice's training. A young baker would be taught not just how to knead dough, but how to doctor it with the right amount of alum to achieve the perfect whiteness and weight. It wasn't taught as how to cheat, but as how to bake. The skills of fraud were passed down as trade knowledge, part of the craft. To them, it wasn't a crime, it was simply competence. Historians call this the normalization of adulteration. The practice was so common, so widespread, and so economically integrated that for many, it ceased to be seen as a moral transgression. It was just the way the world worked. The debate among academics is how much this self-justification was a sincere belief versus a cynical cover story. Was the baker truly convinced he was helping? Or was he just saying what he needed to say to quell his own conscience and deflect criticism? The answer is likely as varied as the individuals themselves. Some were surely cynical villains, while others may have been so deeply enmeshed in the system that they genuinely could not see another way. This normalization is what makes the fight against it so difficult. You're not just fighting a few criminals, you're fighting against common sense. You are challenging the established customs of entire industries. To call for pure food is to be accused of being naive, of not understanding business, of trying to ruin honest, hard-working merchants. But something is beginning to shift. The sheer scale of the problem is becoming impossible to ignore. The isolated voices of protest are starting to link up, to find common cause. There's talk of a man, a doctor, who is not just complaining about the problem, but is systematically proving it exists, using a powerful new tool, a tool that can see the invisible and make the deceptions of the merchants undeniable. He is using a microscope. The name starts as a murmur in the more literate circles, a whisper in the coffee houses and reading rooms that you might overhear as you sweep the floors or collect the empty cups. The name is Hassel, Dr. Hill Hassel. He is not a politician or a radical preacher. He is a physician and a microscopist, a man of science, and he has declared war on adulteration, not with pamphlets or speeches, but with objective, irrefutable, visual evidence. You learn his story in bits and pieces. He was a doctor who became alarmed by the constant, unexplained illnesses he saw among his patients, especially the poor. He suspected the food supply was to blame, but suspicion wasn't enough. He knew that to fight the entrenched interests of the food industry, he needed more than anecdotes, he needed proof. So he turned to his microscope, at the time a relatively new and powerful scientific instrument. Imagine the scene: drive, Hassel in his laboratory, a place of quiet, methodical precision, a world away from the chaotic, grimy streets. He takes a sample of your daily bread, the same loaf you eat. He places a tiny crumb on a glass slide, adds a drop of water, and puts it under the lens of his microscope. For you, the bread is just a heavy, gritty substance, but for Hassel, a hidden universe is revealed. Under the microscope's powerful gaze, the secrets of the loaf are laid bare. He can see the large, irregular starch granules of wheat flour, but alongside them, he sees other, alien shapes. He identifies the small, uniform, and distinctly shaped starch granules of the potato. He sees the sharp, crystalline structures of alum, and most damningly, he can distinguish the microscopic, fossilized remains of diatoms and other organisms found in chalk deposits. They can even, it is claimed, identify the unique cellular structure of ground-up bone. The bread is no longer a matter of opinion or a baker's trade secret. It is a specimen, and its fraudulent contents are as clear and identifiable as the spots on a leopard. He doesn't stop at bread. He puts a drop of milk under his lens and sees not just the familiar globules of fat, but the gruesome, stringy tissues of mashed animal brain and the telltale signs of chalky residue. He examines the teal eaves and finds they are not the leaves of the camellias sinensis plant at all, but the common sloe leaf from an English hedgerow, its surface coated with black leaden Prussian blue. He analyzes the bright red cayenne pepper and finds it is mostly brick dust. What Hassel is doing is revolutionary. He is taking the battle out of the realm of he said, she said, and into the realm of scientific fact. A baker can argue that his intentions are good, but he cannot argue with the microscopic image of plaster of Paris in his product. A grocer can claim his pickles are greened by a secret family recipe, but he cannot deny the presence of copper crystals when they are magnified 100 times. Here's a small, weird fact about his investigation. Hassel didn't work alone. He assembled a team of investigators, a kind of food police, who would fan out across London to purchase samples. They bought from high-end shops in wealthy neighborhoods and from the grim-est stalls in the deepest slums. This was crucial, as it showed that adulteration wasn't just a problem for the poor, it was happening everywhere. Though the specific adulterants were often more sophisticated and sometimes even more dangerous in the products sold to the rich. This methodical approach is a turning point. For decades, reformers had been shouting about the problem, but their cries were often dismissed as sensationalism or anti-business rhetoric. Hassel's work was different. It was calm, clinical, and devastatingly precise. Historians see Hassel as a key figure in the birth of the consumer protection movement. He established a principle that is now taken for granted that consumers have a right to scientific verification of the products they buy. The debate around his work isn't about its accuracy, but about its impact. Was he a lone genius who single-handedly changed public opinion? Or was he simply the right man with the right time? Giving voice to a change that was already beginning to happen, the consensus is that he was a powerful catalyst, providing the scientific backbone that the burgeoning reform movement desperately needed. You hear that, Doctor? Hassel is not keeping his findings to himself. He is not just publishing them in obscure scientific journals. He has found a powerful ally, Thomas Wegley, the editor of a highly respected and widely read medical journal, The Lancet. They are about to publish everything. They are going to name names. They are going to show the public exactly what you have been eating, in excruciating, microscopic detail. The world of the cheating merchant is about to be put under a very bright, very focused light. The change doesn't happen overnight. It's not a sudden explosion. That is slow, rolling thunder that builds week by week. The vehicle for this thunder is the Lancet. You can't afford to buy a copy yourself, but its contents become the talk of the town. You see people clustered around the windows of news shops, reading the display pages. You hear literate men reading passages aloud in pubs. Their voice is a mixture of outrage and grim satisfaction. The microscopic truth is escaping the laboratory and hitting the streets. The series of reports, published under the title The Lancet Analytical Sanitary Commission, is a sensation. Week after week, Hassel and his team tackle a new category of food. 1 week it's bread. The journal prints not just descriptions, but detailed woodcut engravings of the microscopic views. For the first time, you can see the proof. There, printed in black and white, are the chalk particles, the potato starch, the alum crystals, all nestled amongst the wheat. The abstract fear of being cheated is now a concrete, visual reality. The next week it's tea, then coffee, which they find is often made mostly of roasted chicory, acorns, and carrots. Then cocoa, which is bulked up with brick dust and tallow. Then the condiments, with their copper and lead. Each report is a body blow to the food industry. And they do the unthinkable. They publish the names and addresses of the merchants from whom the samples were purchased. This is a move of incredible bravery and immense risk. The journal is immediately hit with a barrage of libel lawsuits from angry shopkeepers and manufacturers. But Thomas Wackley, the editor, is a fighter. He has been a reformer his whole life and he refuses to back down. He stands by Hassel as science and dares the merchants to prove him wrong in court. Most of them, knowing the evidence is true, quietly drop their cases. For you, this is a revelation. The vague, uneasy feeling in your gut, the chronic sickness, the constant suspicion it's all being validated. You weren't imagining it. You weren't weak or unlucky. You were being systematically poisoned, and now you have the pictures to prove it. A profound sense of vindication washes over you, mixed with an even deeper anger. Seeing the truth in print makes the deception feel even more personal, more outrageous. Here's a small, weird detail about the public reaction. It sparked a new kind of consumer behavior, the amateur microscopist. Wealthier, middle-class individuals, intrigued and horrified by the reports, began to buy their own microscopes to test their food. The microscope became a true-love domestic defense. A man might hold a dinner party where the after-dinner entertainment was not music, but examining a sample of the local baker's flour or the grocer's pepper. It became a kind of morbid, scientific parlor game. This new microscopic gaze, as some historians have called it, fundamentally changed the relationship between the consumer and the product. Food was no longer a simple, opaque substance. It was now seen as a complex compound, potentially hiding a secret, microscopic world of fraud. The debate among historians here is about the reach of this new consciousness. Did it trickle down to you, the poorest consumer, directly? Perhaps not. You don't have a microscope. But indirectly, the effect was massive. The public outcry from the middle and upper classes, who had the political influence, the purchasing power to effect change, was deafening. The reports in the Lancet create a language and a framework for your suffering. Before, you just felt sick. Now, you hear people using words like adulteration, alum, and copper sulfate. Your personal, physical misery is connected to a larger, public scandal. This is an incredibly empowering shift. Your problem is no longer just your problem, it's the problem. The pressure on the government, which for so long had resisted any interference, begins to become unbearable. The laissez-faire argument starts to sound less like a principled stand and more like a negligent homicide. The evidence is too clear. The public anger is too loud. And the work of Hassel and the Lancet has provided a scientific and moral sledgehammer that is beginning to crack the foundations of the old, indifferent system. You feel a flicker of something you haven't felt since you first arrived in this city. Hope. Real, tangible hope. Not the naive dream of streets paved with gold, but the hard-won hope that things might, just might, be forced to change. The truth is out. The secrets are exposed. The next logical step, the one that everyone is now demanding, is for the law to finally catch up with reality. The public outcry, fueled by the relentless, scientific revelations in the Lancet, becomes a political force that even the most ardent laissez-faire politician cannot ignore. The demand for action is everywhere, in the newspapers, in parliamentary debates, in the pulpits of reform-minded preachers. The abstract problem of the condition of the poor has been given a concrete, terrifying face. The poison on their dinner plates. The government is finally forced to act. You witness the result of this pressure not as a grand, sweeping change, but as a slow, creaking, and deeply flawed process. In 1860, after years of debate and dilution, Parliament passes the first ever Adulteration of Food and Drink Act. It's a landmark piece of legislation. The first time the British government has made a serious attempt to regulate the nation's food supply on a national level. On paper, it's a victory. You hear the news on the street. There is a sense of triumph. The cheats and poisoners will finally be brought to justice. People say, the law is on our side now. But as the details of the act become clear, the initial optimism begins to fade, replaced by a familiar cynicism. The law, as it turns out, is a mouse pretending to be a lion. The act states that it is illegal to sell food that is injurious to health. This sounds good, but the burden of proof is on the person making the accusation. You, the consumer, would have to prove not only that the food was adulterated, but that the specific adulterant was the direct cause of your illness. Given the state of medical science and the high cost of legal action, this is an almost impossible bar to clear. Even more problematically, the law was not compulsory. It gave local authorities the option to appoint a public analyst, a scientist who could test food samples, but it didn't require them to. Many local councils, concerned about the cost or under the influence of powerful local businessmen who were often on the councils themselves, simply chose not to appoint one. So in many parts of the city, the law exists in theory but has no teeth in practice, and the penalties there are laughably weak. For a first offense, a merchant might face a small fine, an amount they could easily make back in a single day of selling fraudulent goods. The law was designed more as a gentle deterrent than a serious punishment. Here's a small, weird detail that perfectly encapsulates the law's weakness, the knowingly clause. The law made it illegal to knowingly sell adulterated food. This one word created a massive loophole. A merchant could simply claim ignorance. I didn't know the tea was fake, that's how I bought it from the wholesaler. I didn't know there was alum in the baker's stuff. I just know it makes the bread white. Proving what a person knowingly did was a legal nightmare, and many cases fell apart on this point. The historical debate around this first act is intense. Was it a genuine, if flawed, first step towards a safer food system, or was it a deliberate piece of political theater, designed to quiet public outrage while changing as little as possible? In reality, most historians lean towards a mix of both. It was a monumental crack in the edifice of laissez-faire, establishing the principle that the government did have a role in protecting consumers. But it was also a deeply compromised bill, hobbled by vested interests at every stage of its creation. For you, the practical effect is minimal at first. Your bread still tastes of chalk. Your tea is still weak and strange. The grocer on your corner operates with the same casual cynicism as before. The law is a distant rumor, a piece of paper in a government building far away. It hasn't changed the food in your hand. Yet, something has shifted. The law, for all its flaws, has created a new category of crime. Adulteration is no longer just a trade custom, it is now officially against the law. This gives reformers a new weapon. They can now agitate not just for a new law, but for the enforcement of the existing one. They can shame local councils into appointing analysts. They can bring private prosecutions. The battle has moved from the court of public opinion to the actual courts of law. The fight is far from over. It will take subsequent laws in 1872, Yabatsu, and beyond, each one strengthening their regulations, increasing the penalties, and closing the loopholes. Before real, widespread change is felt, but the first, decisive blow has been struck. The principle of absolute non-interference is dead. The idea that food should be safe, and that the law should guarantee that safety, has been born, and this idea, once unleashed, is impossible to put back in the bottle. The years that follow the first Feeble Food Act are not a time of sudden, miraculous change, but of a slow, grinding war of attrition. The great river of fraud doesn't stop flowing, but you start to see small dams and levees being built along its banks. The change is not in your daily loaf of bread, which remains stubbornly suspect, but in the atmosphere, in the conversation, and in the slow shift of power. You see it in the form of a new figure on the streets, the food inspector. He is an agent of the local authority, a man armed with the power of the law, weak as it may be, to enter a shop and demand a sample for analysis. His appearances are rare at first, and he is often met with hostility and derision from the shopkeepers. But his very existence is a revolution. He is the physical embodiment of the new idea that what a merchant does in his back room is no longer his private business, but a matter of public concern. You might witness a scene that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The inspector walks into your local bakery. The baker, who once proudly defended his use of alum, now looks nervous. The inspector takes a loaf, pays for it, and then, in a formal ritual, declares that it is for analysis. He carefully divides it into 3 parts, placing each in a sealed container, one for the baker, one for the analyst, and one to be kept in case of a dispute. The act is methodical, scientific, and official. It's a small piece of bureaucratic theater that signals a profound change. The age of impunity is beginning to end. Newspapers, which once only printed letters of complaint, now have a new source of sensational stories, the results of court cases against adulterators. You might hear someone reading aloud from the paper about a local milkman who was fined 5 shillings for adding 30% water to his milk. The fine is small, but the public shaming is significant. The naming and shaming that the Lancet began is now being carried out by the state. Here's a small, weird fact about this period of early enforcement. It's sparked a scientific arms race. The adulterators, now faced with the threat of analysis, got more creative. They began to search for new adulterants that were harder to detect with the chemical tests of the day. For example, as tests for chalk in milk became more common, some dairymen reportedly switched to using glycerine or other substances to add body without leaving an obvious residue. It was a constant cat-and-mouse game between the public analyst and the fraudulent producer. This leads to a key historical debate. Did these early laws actually reduce adulteration, or just make it more sophisticated in the short term? The answer is probably the latter. The most blatant and clumsy forms of fraud, like putting brick dust in pepper, began to decline because they were too easy to detect. But the more subtle forms, like using low-grade ingredients or chemical additives that weren't yet illegal, likely continued or even increased. The fight was not over, it had just become more technical. However, the tide is undeniably turning. You start to see changes in the marketplace. Some shops begin to advertise their goods as pure or warranted unadulterated. They use the new public anxiety as a marketing tool. For the first time, you have a semblance of a real choice. You might have to pay a little more for the pure tea, but the option is there. Large, reputable companies begin to build their brands around the concept of purity and quality control, realizing that trust is now a valuable commodity. The cumulative effect of the science, the laws, and the public pressure is a slow, rising tide of awareness. You and your neighbors are no longer just passive victims. You are more skeptical. You look at the unnaturally white bread with suspicion, not admiration. You question the source of the cheap meat. You are a more educated consumer, not through formal schooling, but through the harsh lessons of experience, now backed by the authority of public knowledge. The process is frustratingly slow. The changes are incremental, almost invisible from one day to the next. But looking back over the years, the difference is profound. The world is still a hard, grimy, and unfair place. But it is no longer a place where a man can openly sell you a loaf of bread filled with plaster and call it a public service. The very definition of what is acceptable has been rewritten. A ripple of change has started, and you sense that it will, eventually, become a wave. Years have passed. The city's smog is still thick. The noise is still a constant roar, and your life is still one of hard work and little reward. But something fundamental in your daily routine has shifted. It's the morning, and you are buying your bread for the day. You walk past the small, dingy bakery you used to frequent. It's still there, but its loaves look less appealing now. A known quantity of cheapness and deceit. You continue to a slightly larger shop. one with a sign in the window that reads, "Made with pure wheat flour. Noel." The loaf you buy is different. It's not as shockingly white as the old loaves. It's a more natural, creamy color. It's also slightly smaller for the same price, and a little lighter. But when you break it open, the texture is better. It's chewier, more substantial. And the taste. It actually tastes of wheat. It's a simple, honest flavor you haven't experienced in years. It's the taste of progress. This loaf of bread is the culmination of the long, slow battle you have witnessed. It is the result of Dr. Hassel's microscope, the Lancet's brave journalism, the flawed but persistent pressure of the law, and the rising tide of public consciousness. The change is not total, and it is not perfect. You know that somewhere in this vast city, a baker is still mixing chalk into his dough, and a milkman is still visiting the water pump. The fight is not over, but the standard has changed. The baseline has been raised. You no longer have to accept poison as a non-negotiable ingredient in your daily meal. The burden of vigilance has slightly eased. You can buy a pickle and have a reasonable expectation that its greenness comes from the cucumber itself, not from copper. You can give a child a sweet without the gnawing fear that it's a colorful nugget of arsenic. This is not a luxury. It is a basic human dignity that has been fought for and partially won. Here's a small, final, weird fact that brings the story full circle. In the later decades of the 19th century, as public health improved and food became safer, a new kind of nostalgia actually emerged among some writers and social commentators. They would write, almost fondly, about the lost tastes of old London, the fiery kick of the adulterated gin, the unique gaminess of the dubious meat pies. It's a bizarre testament to how the human mind can romanticize even the most horrific of circumstances once they are safely in the past. The historical debate continues to this day, framing this era in different ways. Was it a dark age of brutal exploitation, a great poisoning of the working class, or was it a period of necessary, if painful, transition, a chaotic crucible from which modern standards of public health and consumer rights were forged? The truth, as you have lived it, is that it was both. You have endured the exploitation, and you have witnessed the beginning of the reform. You are a survivor of the dark age and a citizen of the new one. As you eat your honest bread, you reflect on the journey. You arrived in a city that saw you as nothing more than a cog in its great industrial machine, a body to be fueled as cheaply as possible, with no regard for your well-being. You have lived through a time when every meal was a gamble, a landscape of fraud where the most basic staples were a source of danger and anxiety. But you have also lived to see the change. You have seen the power of science to reveal truth, the power of the press to spread it, and the power of people to demand something better. The world is still deeply unjust, but the idea that your life has a basic value, that you should not be poisoned for profit, has taken root. It's a fragile root, but it is growing. The bread you hold is no longer just a lump of calories. It is a symbol. It represents a hard-won victory in the long, ongoing struggle for a simple, decent life. It's not the end of the story, but it is, for you, the end of a nightmare. As you finish your meal, for the first time in a long time, your stomach is settled, and your mind is, for a moment, at peace. Tomorrow's breakfast, you think, might be even better. The city's perpetual twilight begins to soften, the gas lamps casting gentler, longer shadows. The roar of industry fades to a distant, rhythmic hum, the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Your journey through this grim culinary past is over now. The metallic taste of leadened copper has faded from your tongue, replaced by the simple, clean memory of that final, honest loaf of bread. The knot of anxiety that has sat in your stomach for so long has finally, gently, uncoiled. You are no longer on those hard, grimy cobblestones. You are somewhere warm, somewhere safe. The damp chill has left your bones. The sounds you hear are no longer the cries of vendors or the clang of machinery, but the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing, a quiet and peaceful cadence. The anxieties of that other world, the constant need to question, to suspect, to survive, can be laid to rest. There are no more labels to read, no more colors to distrust. You can feel the heavy weight of the day lifting, like a thick London fog finally clearing to reveal a quiet, story sky. The memories of the chalky bread and the watery milk are dissolving, becoming distant and dreamlike, hazy figures in a story that has already been told. They can't touch you here. Here, in this quiet space, you are nourished. You are safe. You can let go. Allow the gentle current of sleep to pull you away from the shore of wakefulness, out into a calm, deep ocean of rest. The end of the article. Good night.